Hey folks, Zach Osterman here, Insider Indianapolis Star with your Friday rundown and your three keys, as always, to Indiana's football game this weekend. Start with football, then we'll talk a little basketball. We got to talk to Mike Woodson this morning, his first sort of pre-game press conference, Zoom press conference of the season, obviously looking ahead to this weekend's exhibition against UIndy. Beginning with football, just talking about Penn State, I imagine, with all respect, more people are interested in basketball at this point. But I think the three things I'll be looking for in Indiana's game at Penn State, Mike Niziolek will be there for us and for the Herald Times. Number one is Brendan Sorsby. Finally Indiana kind of carries a quarterback forward as its defined starter for more than one game. It seems like Indiana is intent, for better or worse, on standing behind Sorsby now. We can have a whole separate conversation about just sort of how long it took Indiana to get to this point and frankly, how damaging it's probably been in some ways to just the progress of the offense. And, of course, the coordinator change is also a factor in that. It's sort of a complicating factor that was always going to make it tricky. But, Sorsby is now in a situation where at least it feels like he can – he can play, he can learn, he can make mistakes, he can grow from mistakes, and not feel like he's just sort of constantly trying to fend off the quarterback battle, so to speak. This is obviously going to be, you would imagine, as sort of oppressive and intimidating an environment as he's ever played in. Happy Valley is one of the best home atmospheres in the country. How does he handle that? And do we see progress from last week? Obviously, a different kind of challenge against Rutgers at home as opposed to Penn State on the road, but can we chart some progress in his game? Does he look more confident? Has he opened the playbook, and maybe he's got some stuff that either he was trying last week, it wasn't working, or some stuff that maybe Indiana wasn't ready to put on his plate yet that it now is. And all this stuff can be a bit of a movable feast, and you can sort of, you can analyze it in different ways, but I think, just win or lose, all eyes on Sorsby for Indiana here, just to kind of get a sense for what the Hoosiers have at quarterback, frankly, going forward for probably at least, it seems like anyway, the rest of this season. That's number one. Number two would be explosive plays. Penn State, one of the best defenses in the country, doesn't tend to allow them. Its offense at times, though, has also had problems generating them. Not always, but Penn State, for being, what is widely recognized as one of the two or three best teams in one of the best conferences in the country. Penn State just doesn't, it's pretty middle of the pack in the Big Ten. They do produce some more explosive passing plays, but, Drew Aller hasn't passed for more than 200 yards in, I think, 5 games, or 5 games ago, depending on how you want to see the last 4 games, he hasn't broken 200 yards passing. And some of that's going to be game state and game plan and, like that game against Ohio State, obviously, last week became a real kind of slog, a real low-scoring defensive affair. But you do sort of watch, if Indiana can limit those, then Indiana can potentially at least kind of give itself a window to maybe get some points on the board, get a foothold in the game, and just give itself something to hang on to, something to defend, something to fight for. If Indiana can create some of those, then that's fantastic. Penn State, again, is a very, very, very good team defensively, and explosive plays, particularly the explosive plays that could lead to points, would be worth their weight in gold in this game. But, if you see Indiana start to allow Penn State to tear off big chunks of yardage, at a pop, that's kind of going to be an alarm bells moment in this matchup. So that's number two. And then number three, and this is, very difficult to quantify, you're still waiting to see if this team can kind of dig its heels in anywhere this season. And obviously it's lost, I think it's 3 games in a row now. They're 2-5. The technically bowl eligibility is still on the table. You wouldn't expect them to win this weekend, of course. But, does there come a point where this group, does find it's able to just sort of plant its feet in the ground and just sort of say the slide stops here and we start pushing back and progressing and getting better a little bit, not exactly, but a little bit, like I think we, in fairness, saw Indiana do toward the end of last season, at least pre-Dexter Williams' injury. Again, that doesn't necessarily have to manifest itself in a win on Saturday, but I think you after some some frankly uninspiring sort of total game performances across the last whatever number of, let's say, 3-4 weeks. Does Indiana find that fight a little bit? And I think that's probably the third thing I'll be looking for. So that's football, kind of done it off to one side. Highlights from Mike Woodson's Zoom conference. I think the biggest one everyone was curious about was Mackenzie Mbako. Woodson suggested Mbako will play Sunday. He's been practicing. There was no talk of a suspension. Woodson's words, I think, were that's behind us and we've got to move on. It was something very similar to that. If it wasn't that, forgive me. I probably should have come prepared with the exact quote. But here's what he said. That's behind us. We've got to move forward. I think he didn't flat out say no suspension for Mackenzie Mbako. That does sound anyway like he doesn't intend one. You would imagine, of course, there's been some behind the scenes punishment, as there always is going to be for these sorts of things. I don't know that I'm super surprised by the lack of a suspension. It's worth saying Xavier Johnson didn't miss any court time for his off the court thing in April of the previous year, going back to last season. I think that there's an extent to which some of this stuff Woodson just sort of prefers to handle in-house. I know there was obviously the Northwestern situation. That was a violation of team rules on a game day or a game, trip, however you want to see that. So I think in Woodson's mind, not necessarily that one thing is more or less grave, but that they're kind of different situations. One way or the other, Mackenzie Mbako, Woodson said, will play Sunday. So that's that kind of resolves that, at least for the exhibition opener. Two players that won't play Sunday are Caleb Banks and Ja'Kai Newton. Newton is still dealing with the knee issue that it's kind of held over from his senior year of high school, and there have been some sort of updates to that, some further procedures that have needed to be done, and boxes that have needed to be ticked, and so he's still out. Caleb Banks will be out too. He's had a groin injury in the preseason. Mike Woodson said he's coming back, but they're kind of easing him back in. Woodson said, I've had players in the past that have had groin issues, and if you're not careful with them, they linger and linger and linger and linger and linger, and you just kind of want to nip it in the bud, basically. He did say, essentially, that if tomorrow's game were an imperative for whatever reason, Caleb Banks would play. He said, Banks could play. He's just sort of choosing to keep him, just to keep sitting him and let Banks ease his way back in as much as possible, make sure the groin is healed, make sure it's not something that carries over into the season. So, very much one of those kind of like if Indiana was playing in a Big Ten tournament title game tomorrow, I think Caleb Banks would probably be playing. As it stands, it's an exhibition opener, and so they're not. And then the third thing I wanted to bring up that I thought was interesting, there was a lot of just sort of asking Woodson about, different individual players in the preseason who stepped up, things like that. He mentioned Trey Galloway as a player who's really shown a sort of a consistent level of performance this season. He also mentioned Mbako that way as somebody who's kind of stood out through most of the preseason. He talked about Xavier Johnson, said his game is fine. His game will come. There's no concern about that. He said, my challenge to him is much more to be a leader and to be vocal and to hold guys accountable, be that kind of that team captain and point guard off the court, maybe a little bit as well as on the court, or at least sort of, away from the spotlight, away from the cameras, as well as obviously what a point guard is going to have to do in a game in terms of, sort of giving teammates marching orders and moving everybody around. The one other player that Woodson kind of went out of his way to praise was Gabe Cupps. He said that Cupps, I think his words were that he should have mentioned him sooner, and in the context of that question about who's been standing out, but the Cupps has looked really good. The quote that stuck with me, he said, quote, "winning basketball plays, that's what I like to call it, because he does a lot of good things to help you win games." Obviously, that's encouraging to hear about a freshman. I think it's even more encouraging to hear about a point guard. Indiana's in a position where Cupps is probably going to have to take on significant bench minutes. Newton is obviously still sidelined. You don't have a third sort of recognized out-and-out point guard. You've got some other guys that can probably take the ball in their hands, like a Trey Galloway, for example. But Cupps and Johnson are your two clear-cut point guards. Johnson can't play 40 minutes a night. That's obviously not practical. If Cupps can even just be the guy that gives him, 10, 12 minutes a break, maybe 12, 15 minutes a break as the season goes on, and Cupps maybe earns his way into a little bit more playing time, then that's a substantial development both for Indiana this season and for Cupps moving forward, because obviously, come hell or high water, no Xavier Johnson after this season. There are no more waivers, no more COVID years, no nothing. 6 is pretty much the outside edge of how long you get to play college basketball, and 6 years. So, there's every chance that Gabe Cupps is going to be point guard 1, this time a year from now, or at least, probably no matter what the point guard situation is, in a larger role, because Johnson, who is such a high usage player and such an important player for Indiana, will be gone. So to hear about that progress, both in terms of maybe what Cupps can give Indiana off the bench this year, and also maybe what you can start to expect from him moving forward, I think is important and it's meaningful. Obviously, though, we will actually be able to judge some of these things with our own eyes starting on Sunday. The game is at 1 o'clock against University of Indianapolis. I will double check that while we're talking, just so that I don't give anybody. I have been guilty at times of giving people the the wrong information, but it's UIndy, 1 o'clock, Bloomington, Sunday, October 29th at Assembly Hall. And it will be our first look at what is, I think, going to be a fascinating basketball team for the first couple months of this season. We talked about it in our podcast earlier this week. If you watched it on the YouTube channel or you listened, anywhere you subscribe, mind your banners. We appreciate everybody who hits the like and subscribe buttons on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, wherever. One thing that I said in talking with Mike Nislik, and I think Mike kind of felt similar, is it could be a tough couple months to start the season. Indiana could have some real growing pains, but that doesn't mean that those growing pains aren't necessarily going to be beneficial going forward. I think they can be, because this is a team that is going to have to grow up in a number of different ways that you ultimately just can't really simulate in a preseason environment or even in an exhibition environment. And so I think it's going to be fascinating to watch this team grow. I think at times it's probably going to come with some speed bumps, but I think there may also be some real high notes as well. And it all gets started Sunday. We'll leave it there. For Zach Osterman, not for Zach Osterman, for the Indianapolis Star, I am Zach Osterman. Thank you so much for watching. This has been the Friday Rundown. Enjoy your weekend. We'll see you next week.